Mhm.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is the Robinsons. And yes, it's been a very long time since we have uploaded a video. I think May 31st was the last time we actually did a video. So thank you for stopping by. And we won't be before you long. And that may be a problem because when two preachers say they're not going to be before you long, you may have a
You may
problem.
have
But
a problem.
but we promise not to be too long. But we want to talk about a topic in regard to the United States Constitution and why it is important to understand what that document means to us. The Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the United States of America. It helps to organize the United States government and the relationship of the federal government with each of its states, citizens, and all people within the United States. Well, already I can hear you saying, Pooh, what are we in high school government class again? And you're probably saying, I'm out of here. But hang on for just a little bit, just a little bit. We want to talk about a specific area of the Constitution and how it has caused further misunderstanding and anger in regard to the wholeness of a person. Yes, I'm talking about the three-fifths clause, or most will refer to it as the three-fifths of a person clause, but actually it is called the three-fifths compromise clause. For Black Americans, the three-fifth clause has caused a lot of anger. Well, this is how it goes. The compromise was between the southern states and the northern states. And specifically, how do we count slaves? The southern states wanted their cake and they wanted to eat that cake. So they wanted it both ways. Number one, when it came to counting slaves, they didn't want them to be counted when it came to taxation or direct taxes. They wanted to make sure that they were treated as property. Because, in other words, if you had more property, meant more taxes they had to pay. They didn't want that. Number two, the South wanted to count their slaves as people in order to have more representation and thus have more power in Congress. Well, the Northern State says, no way, Jose, that wasn't going to happen because we don't have no slaves. So that wasn't going to work. So the compromise was we will allow you three-fifths or 60% of your slave population to be included. Well, what does that look like? In regard to the census, we're talking census, for every 5 slaves, your state will get to have 3 persons, 3 people counted in the census. Well, in my opinion, that's still too much. 60% is still too much. That's over 50%. So, in my opinion, that's pretty bad. However, if they did not compromise, they would not have been able to establish the United States or be able to unite the states. So they had to compromise. All right. So this was a very simplified explanation. But Mr. Husband here is going to dive in a little deeper. So take it away, husband.
All right, the three-fifths clause, most people have heard about it. I've talked to some people and I ask them, have they heard about the three-fifths clause and what do they know about the three-fifths clause? And some people haven't heard it, but most people in academia, politics,
Sure,
journalism, all of that, they're very familiar with it. So since we're Bible teachers, we're going to treat the Constitution as a Bible.
Okay.
We're just going to read the text because that's with anything. If you're going to teach something, you're going to look at the text. So let's look at a portion of the text.
Okay.
Of the three-fifths, where does this three-fifths clause come from?
Okay.
It's Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution for the purposes of discussing the Congress. In the Senate, we each get 2 senators from each state. But when it comes to representatives of that state, that's when they're counted and enumerated. And that's where the clause comes in. And so let's read part of that.
Okay.
Representation or representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. So that's an old word. Several means various.
Various states.
Because remember, this is written back in the 1700s. It's Old English. Right. So the various states which may be included within this union. So all the states that are going to be included in the union of the United States, because the Constitution was written to form a more perfect union. How do we get representatives? So it says several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, according to the respective numbers of that particular state.
Okay.
How are they going to calculate that? Which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons. And that's where a lot of people get confused when they look at that whole number of free person. That also is Old English, old language.
Sure.
Whole number just means we're going to count all the citizens of that state. We're going to count all of them, a whole number. Okay, so it's the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. Those were the indentured servants.
Okay.
Who usually serve for anywhere from 5 to 7 years. Sometimes those indentured servants also included people like apprentice, blacksmith apprentice or something like that. They work with a blacksmith for 7 years, and then they're off on their own. So they're included in that number, the whole persons. And then it says, and excluding Indians not taxed, because they had treaties with them, so they were already here in the United States. Everybody's fully aware with that. They weren't considered citizens, so they made treaties with them, so they weren't included for the purpose of taxation, representation, all that stuff.
Okay.
And then it says 3/5 of all other persons. That's the 3/5 clause. And then that's where a lot of people read into the text. We often talk about anytime you study any document, certainly you study the Bible, you study the Constitution, you study anything, any works that a person writes, any primary doctrine, since they were written long ago, the best way to understand the context is to go in and draw out the information rather than impose.
Okay.
So we have some groups of people here. We have the whole number of free persons. We have indentured servants. We have Indians, which weren't included, but we're still talking about groups of people. So then who's left then of the groups of people in the United States at this time? We have free people, Indians, and
slaves.
What other group? Slaves.
Slaves.
That's what it's referring to. That 3/5 all others is referring to slaves. It's not referring to just Black people. And as we're going to look through it as we go through. So we laid that groundwork. We're going to come back to this clause and passage and look at it. This clause is often misinterpreted to mean that African Americans as individuals are considered 3/5 of a person.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you
your head,
3/5 of a
maybe
person?
The left arm and the right leg and a couple toes.
Divide people up
I don't know either.
The 3/5 clause, in fact, declared that for purposes of representation in Congress, a proportion of the slave population would be counted.
Okay.
So that's 3/5 of a population, not 3/5 of a person. I feel like I want to say that 1,000 times
we probably should.
to counter the number of times that it's been said throughout history that 3/5 meant 3/5 of a person. But it's not 3/5 of a person. It's 3/5 of a population. It is a proportion of a population, not a proportion of a person. 3/5, or, and as we heard earlier, 60% of the slave population was counted for the purpose of determining how many representatives a state in the Union would have.
Well, one of the most widely used means to defame the Constitution is to manipulate the perception of the 3/5 compromise. Agenda-driven academics and committed ideologues routinely state the U.S. Constitution only recognized Black people as 3/5 of a person. No context is given. They just throw it out there and let the anger fall. Just let it rain down. This often repeated falsehood foments disrespect of the Constitution and contempt for the founding fathers who authored it.
Those old racist old men.
Those old white racist people.
Why should we listen to anything they have to say?
We don't listen to them.
Many influential leaders in America have perpetuated this falsehood deliberately or inadvertently. For example, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice routinely stated in her speeches, in the original U.S. Constitution, I was only 3/5 of a person. So she really took it personal. Then San Antonio's U.S. District Judge Fred Beery, while addressing the Austin Bar Association U.S. District, used an example of then recent Heisman Trophy winner Robert Griffin III. So he was saying this at the time, Robert Griffin. He asserted, quote, in 1787, when the Constitution was ratified, Griffin's ancestors were counted only as 3/5 of a human being. Now he really imposed on the passage. He got out of that clause, 3/5 all others. He got out of that meant that Black people were 3/5 of a human being. I think that's reading a little much into it.
A little bit.
Now I'm not questioning and judging the motives of these individuals, Condoleezza Rice and this professor. I'm not judging their motives because I don't know why they said that. I don't understand why they would repeat something like that or add.
That's fair.
But then there are other individuals, and also, and I'm sorry, this fella also I'm going to mention David Gaines. I'm not questioning his motives. Also, I'm just mentioning. But the fact is, he is the director of human rights, civil rights, and citizenship program at the Constitutional Accountability Center. It's a think tank and a law firm. So this guy is a constitutional specialist.
Okay.
Human rights and civil rights. That's what he deals with.
Okay.
He stated someone who was enslaved would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Now he got closer to the original meaning of it because he said someone who is counted as a slave.
Okay.
That's what it was referring to. But then he says 3/5 of a person. Again, how do you get 3/5 of a person out of that?
Okay.
So I'm not questioning or judging their motives. Many times some things are just repeated and said often, and they're innocently just saying this. But there are other individuals who have other motives.
Okay.
Such as Chris Matthews, Al Gore, Jesse Jackson, university professors, pastors, and many countless individuals have repeated this unfortunate narrative. And Chris Matthews and Al Gore certainly said it in the context of the aftermath of the whole Bush-Gore thing. You remember that with the what do they call it? The hanging Changling Chads or whatever it was.
I don't remember.
The close election down in Florida. And so Al Gore mentions it out of anger. And Jesse Jackson, they say these things out of anger because they're like, why would you vote for a man who believes in the Constitution, a strict constructionist who believes in the Constitution that says that Black people are 3/5 of a person? You know, it's in that context. So they intentionally rile up people when they say it.
Okay.
So let's talk about the truth. What is the truth of this 3/5 clause? As we mentioned, when you look at Section 1, was it Article 1, Section 3, Article 1, Section 2,
Clause 3.
When you look at that and read it, it even gives an explanation. It gives you an example because we mentioned it's talking about the census also, because state population changes from time to time.
Sure.
So every 10 years you count again. And what they said is, for example, if you have 30,000 citizens, you get one representative. 60,000 citizens, you get 60,000, you get two representatives. 90,000, you get three, and on and on. You get the picture. Whereas state senators, no matter how many people in the state, you get two.
Just two.
So that's what it was talking about. Well, the southern states wanted to count the entire slave population.
Of course.
This would increase their number of members in Congress.
Yes.
So that they can hold on to the slave
power.
The northern delegates and others, usually the abolitionists, they opposed slavery. They wanted to count only the free persons, including free Black Americans in North and South.
Yes.
And so that's what they want to do. Was they obviously had to have a compromise, or they wouldn't have gotten anywhere. So the 3/5 clause was part of a series of compromises enacted by the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The most notable and other clauses prohibited slavery, also known as the Northwest Ordinance, was ratified around the same time.
Okay.
Let's look at this Northwest Ordinance to prove that the founding fathers were not in favor of slavery, because many people teach and seem to suggest that America gave birth to slavery.
Right.
I mean, there was slavery nowhere else in all the known world until America was founded, and then that's when slavery comes. As a matter of fact, even with the New York Times, that one professor who wrote the article, the series 1619, which basically suggests that at America's founding, when the first slave ships came over here in 1690, that established slavery, and America, such an evil nation. It's related to that. And so, but the truth is, Great Britain, when the colonies came here, Great Britain imposed slavery on the colonies. And so as time went on, Washington and Jefferson and many of the founders who owned slaves, they inherited those slaves. But so they weren't in favor of slavery. They were always trying to abolish slavery, get rid of slavery. And proof of that is the Northwest Ordinance. So it set forth the requirements of statehood for the prospective territories, any territories that were going to grow beyond these 13 colonies. It received House approval on July 21st, 1789, Senate approval August 4th, 1789. This is all during the same time as the Constitution was written. So to show that they were not in favor of slavery. It was signed into law by President George Washington, August 7th, 1789. And so it originally applied to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Then Congress also applied it to other territories that were to join later, Mississippi, Alabama, all of these states. Article 6 in the Northwest Ordinance says this: there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. And then it goes on. So right there in the Northwest Ordinance, there was no slavery was going to be instituted into those territories. So that shows that the founding fathers wanted to do everything they could to get rid of slavery.
The problem the founding fathers faced was that they didn't know how to get rid of slavery without tearing the nation apart or devastating the economy. Jefferson said, this is his quote, that maintaining slavery was akin to holding, I gotta find it, holding, hang on, where is it?
I don't know. Here you go. I don't know where mine went. There you are. You got, just read that one.
I got it. Anyway, holding the wolf by the ear. Sorry for that. That's terrible blunder. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. They actually laid the groundwork of abolishing of slavery with Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the new Constitution with the whole 3/5 clause.
So it was the very 3/5 clause that was getting ready to abolish slavery. Not supporting the ideal that Black people were 3/5 of a person. Also, the Slave Trade Act of 1798 prohibited American ships from the use in the slave trade. So they had, in 1798, they had the Slave Trade Act, which American ships could not be used in the Slave Trade Act. Only foreign flag vessels were used. And so this shows in the 3/5 clause that they were working on clearly was not saying Black people were 3/5 of a person, because there were free Black Americans who voted during that time.
It's true.
They were included in this whole number of free persons. So when it talks about counting the whole number of free persons, that included Black Americans. But the narrative always is that all Black people were slaves. See, that's how they get around. They think that in the early days that every Black person in America was a slave, and that is just not true. So that's a false narrative as well. In fact, based in part on the efforts of Richard Bassett, James Madison, James Monroe, Bushrod Washington, Charles Carroll, William Few, John Marshall, Richard Stockton, Zephaniah Swift, and many others, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts began abolishing slavery in 1780.
That's good.
That's 19 years before the Constitution. So that was plenty of time to have free African Americans vote. Connecticut and Rhode Island did so in 1784. Vermont in 1786, New Hampshire in 1792, and New York in 1799. So consequently, there were free Black Americans who voted to ratify the Constitution. And so again, this is a clearly misunderstood or intentionally crafted narrative to get people to think ill of the Constitution by creating this notion that all Black people were slaves and none of them had a right to vote. So therefore, since all Black people were slaves, then 3/5 were referring to all Black people. And so therefore, they were saying all Black people are 3/5 of a person. And that's just not true. 3/5 referred to a proportion of a population,
We got that.
not a proportion of a person.
We got it now.
That's what I said. You got to keep saying it. So because to counteract what we hear all the time, the Constitution says Black people are 3/5 of a person. Well, keep saying this over. 3/5 refers to a proportion of a population, not a proportion of a person. According to Dr. Carol Swain, in a was a PragerU video, very good. Go to that, and she
is awesome.
Explains the 3/5 clause. Very good, very professional, more professional than what we're doing.
Yes.
But we have a voice and we're allowed to talk too. But if you want to see some profession, look at Carol Swain, Dr. Carol Swain, PragerU. She says in the 1790 census, the free states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware had a population of 1.8 million free people. Sounds like a very small amount, but we're talking a long time ago.
Sure, that's a
we're
lot
talking
of
about
people.
Before a lot of immigration took place. And,
sure.
But 1.8 million in the North, in the free North.
Okay.
Slave states of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia had a population of 1.1 million free whites. But then they had a slave population of 633,000.
All right.
So that comes up to 1.7 million. So 1.7 million in the South, a mixture of free and slave, and then 1.8 million in the North. That's a pretty close number. By the time of the Civil War, the slave population had grown to 4 million. So that greatly increased the numbers of people in the southern states. So could you imagine if 100% of the slave population had been counted? Slavery may have lasted until the 21st century.
My goodness.
Because they'd have had more representatives to hold on to that evil institution.
Yes, sir.
But thank God for the 3/5 clause, which minimized that and then put it into it. But what's wonderful is, and we're almost finished.
We're almost finished.
The 3/5 clause remained in force until the post-Civil War 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves.
Yes.
And then also the 14th Amendment, which gave full citizenship to the slaves, freed slaves.
Freed slaves.
And then the 15th Amendment, which granted right to vote for these freed slaves.
Yes.
13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, all civil rights amendments.
Yes.
So the civil rights era did not begin in the 1960s.
No.
It was in the 1860s under Republican Congress and a Republican president.
Yes.
That's important to note.
And there was no big switch either.
No,
that's another topic.
But this is important because this is significant. Because what we want to do is we want to look at, again, the context of a thing. When we look at Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, which originally mentions it, and it uses that language, 3/5 of all other persons, for all others. Well, it's interesting when we get to the 14th Amendment, which is after the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. So now there are no more slaves in the United States.
All right.
So the language of the 14th Amendment is going to reflect that. And so let's look at that. The language of the 14th Amendment further clarifies the 3/5 clause does not refer to Black people in general, but to slaves specifically. Let's look at Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that's saying that all of those freed Black individuals, they're born in America They are citizens of America and citizens of the state that they reside in. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunity of the citizens of the United States. So no state should take away their rights like they were doing back then after this legislation without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So they have full citizens' rights and full equal protection of the law is referring to those blacks who are now free.
Yes.
But look at section number 2. There's going to be a clause that's missing out of section number 2 because we don't need it anymore.
All right.
So we still need to count representatives, though.
That still happens.
Because that happens every 10 years.
Sure.
And so we need to enumerate. How are we going to do that? There's a calculation process. Listen to section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. Same thing as it says in Article 1, Section 2. Same language. It says counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. Now, the other one says you count the whole number of free persons, also the indentured servants. That language is not there anymore because there's no more indentured service. And then also it excludes that all other persons, 3/5 of all others, because that was a slave population. There is no more slavery. So everybody is free. The whole number, it still uses the language, whole number of free persons in each state. But so it's not saying that white people are whole and black people are half or 3/5 or something. No, it's just talking about the entirety. There are no more slaves. There is no more 3/5 clause.
Yes.
The 3/5 clause pertain directly to the slave population. Now let's wrap this whole thing up. Frederick Douglass, now, and here's our history lesson. Because, history has been revised over the years by many leftists and progressives and a lot of things. But let's talk about Frederick Douglass for a second. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a national leader in the abolitionist movement and was noted for his fiery oratory and anti-slavery writings.
Yes, yes.
He toured around the country and later around the world, giving speeches and meeting with both pro and anti-slavery advocates.
Yes.
Originally, Douglass was told that the Constitution was pro-slavery document.
Well, we've heard that plenty of times.
He was originally told that by his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent abolitionist, social reformer, and suffragist. But when persuaded to look for himself, he quickly changed his mind, saying that the 3/5 compromise was a downright disability laid upon the slaveholding states that deprived them of 2/5 of their natural basis for representation. So here, William Lloyd Garrison, for whatever reason, again, not judging his motives, he passed on that narrative also, saying that the Constitution was originally a slave, slavery favor. Well, then he encouraged Douglass, read it yourself. And so when Douglass read it himself, just by the mere language that he read, he looked, he says, this is not talking about 3/5 of a person. So he is the one, Frederick Douglass is the one who corrected that narrative. In his day.
Okay.
He provided clarity on this issue.
Okay.
In a speech delivered in Glasgow, Scotland on March 26, 1860, Douglass explained the true meaning of the 3/5 compromise. He said this: it is a downright disability laid upon the slave-holding states. So he admitted that the 3/5 clause was against the slave-holding states.
Okay.
He called it a disability put on them. He says, one of which deprives those states of 3/5 of their natural basis of representation. So, or 2/5.
2/5.
So the 3/5 clause means 3/5 of the slave population was counted, or 60%. That means 2/5 of their population wasn't. So basically, he's saying they've lost 2/5 of population in order to influence. So he says that's a good thing. He says a black man in a free state is worth just 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state. as a basis of political power under the Constitution. Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving an increase of 2/5 of the political power to free over slave states. So again, it gave the freed slaves an advantage so they can have more representatives over time, and they would be able to eventually get rid of this horde, cursed institution of slavery. And so here, Frederick Douglass said that in a speech and taught that to others in his day. But again, that was 1860. And unfortunately, over time, that the narrative of Black people being 3/5 of a person won out. And that's what we hear all the time. So
therefore, the 3/5 clause was written for sole purpose of limiting congressional representation of the slave states and denied the slave states additional pro-slavery representation in Congress. Well, why go through all of this? Why even bother? Well, I understand that truth sets a person free.
Yes.
It absolutely does. Amen. Now, if I continue to believe the narrative that Black people are 3/5 of a person, then I will hate the founding fathers. I will decide that the Constitution is just not for me, and America is an awful country if I keep this running narrative in my mind. Well, that's why reading primary source documentation is important. As Christians, we believe that the Bible is a primary source documentation, and so therefore we read the Bible. We don't read about the Bible. We don't read books about the Bible. We just read the Bible to get our information. And so it is with the U.S. Constitution. It is a primary source document. Read it for yourself. Read what the founding fathers were saying about all people. Read it line by line, rather than hearing it from people who may not understand it, because we're not judging, or from people who may have a motive of further division. We don't need any more division. Truth does set you free. So that's all we need to say about it. And we're hoping that this will help shed a little bit of light on the area of the Constitution that continues to anger people of color. We're hoping that this will spark your interest to read the Constitution for yourself and get an understanding, because truth will set you free.
Amen. Very good. And when you read the Constitution, then read the Federalist Papers along with that.
Yes, that's important.
The Federalist Papers were 85 essays written by some of the founders to explain the Constitution. So they explained what they meant by the 3/5 clause and various things. And then also you have the Constitutional Convention notes while they were hashing all of this out. In the process
of doing it.
You know, you can read the argument from the North and the argument from the South and why they wanted to do this and how they came to the compromise. You can read all of that primary source information and come to your own conclusion rather than just listening to what the newsman says or the professor and all those kind of things. So
sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
Well, thanks for stopping by. We weren't too bad.
Not too bad.
We weren't too bad. Anyway, have a great day and God bless you.
Yes. Yeah, because we're still looking at